Hello, everyone. I have to stop and first say thank you, Courtney. It's been amazing to work with her in the last few months and to be here today. And it's been amazing to look at this community, and we were just talking about who's here, and it just seems like a really active and vibrant community of people interested in the arts. And to engage in that is a very special thing. And so I thank Courtney for organizing that and supporting that in all of its ways. That's important in any city, so yay, Courtney. That's for you. So tonight, I'm going to take you through some work. And the title of this talk is called Seeing Surface. And it's in response to two ideas. And so this is a talk about race. And it's also a talk about photography and what I'm interested in what seem like two very disparate things. And so I'm going to start with the work on the far side, which is character recognition, and take you to how I got to my white friends. So everyone keeps asking me, like, how did you get there? And I got there through a series of very different stages in what doesn't appear to be logical terms. So in the summer of 2004, I was teaching in Rochester Institute of Technology and RIT in upstate New York. And it's an institution, it's a place where Kodak, George Eastman House, photography, it's a beacon of photographic knowledge and process. And while I was there, I was young and excited and just wanted to learn, oh my eyes. I was my second or third year of tenure track there, and just knew that I was in this place where photography was respected and worshipped. And so there was a man named Mark Osterman who teaches photographic processes. He's actually the head archivist of photographic processes at George Eastman House. And him and his wife taught a variety of processes. And I said, well, I'm going to take those workshops on my own time. And I was really interested in a process called ambrotypes. So this process, I'm stalling for a moment. But this process is really linked to the invention of photography, really made in the 1850s and 60s. And so you're asked to sort of sit for a very long exposure, 2 minutes long, and you then go into the darkroom and play with magical chemistry. And when I was done with that process, and I was asked to sit for my own picture, and when I was done with that process, I made this photograph of myself. You guys are responsible. Fun now. Okay, I know where I'm going. All right, so and so you're sitting there and you're pouring chemistry and you're sitting there and you're marveling at all of this, and I'm in a room, and it's a small workshop, 5 or 6 people, and this plate, it's a piece of glass, is about 5 by 7 inches and fits in my hand. And so I make this picture and I look at it instantly and I say, oh my God, I look like a slave. Look at me, I look like a slave. And I turn to the person next to me, I look like a slave. And they just sort of smiled. And so my inclination was like, there's something incredibly strange about me sitting here in a tank top with binder clips on it, in this contemporary moment, making pictures, but feeling like I was thrown back 100 years in time. And what does that mean? And there's meaning here, and there's a way to engage this process to talk about something. And I didn't know what that something was. But I knew if I was to leave that place without making a second one, I would be really, really a bad person. Because I'm like, well, if you do one, you don't really know what you're doing. But if you have 2, and in the second one, you can perform what you think your 19th century self would look like as you stare off into space longingly for that, that story, that narrative of having looked at all of these photographic images had happened time and time again. And so I sat there and I said, I don't know what this means. This process is complicated, which I will explain in a second. But it's really important. I'm just going to make a few notes that if you look at the edges of this, you can see that this is on clear glass. Because this edge, that white edge here, is the glass itself, and then it's edged again, because there's a black piece of paper sitting behind it, right, to make the image visible. So if you just had this thing, it would just be sort of this milky image on a clear piece of glass. And I was uninterested in that, but I was interested in the type of image that happened when this black paper, or this black image was applied on the backside. So, summer goes on, and I'm working on a lot of different projects that have nothing to do with photographic processes, and Katrina hits. And all of a sudden, I had been doing projects in which I was reading the comment sections of the New York Times, of the Wall Street Journal, and I would read to myself what I was reading on the paper every day. And those comments were immediately talking about, this is the deluge, send them back to Africa. And it was accompanied by photographs of black people trying to survive. And I was 1,000 miles away in upstate New York, and I was flattened. I didn't understand how, or it took me a moment to understand that these people were being described with no information, right? Just the photographs immediately told them, no, they're black, they're bad, they should go away, this is God helping them. And it just made me think about, well, how is the photograph helping in the reading and understanding it, and a description of these people? So, I'm skipping the black side. So it took me, I won't do that because there's things being recorded. So it took me 2 years to learn this process and to figure out this process. I described it briefly as a really long exposure. These are, if you know anything about film, when I finally conquered the process, this has an ISO of 2. And so there are lots of things that I had to learn. Instead of sitting underneath this beautiful skylight, I had to learn how to modify lights. I had to learn the chemistry of this, and it took 2 years, but I finally started to make images. And this was one of the first images I made, and to me, having seen you all in the room, I don't think this is how you would describe me. And it immediately talked to me about this first image, which isn't in the series, and it's just something I keep for myself. It shows to me the power of how photographs can describe and how photographs lie in their description. So I knew I had hit something, and I just was like, well, what is this? Why do I still look at this and think slave? Is it, what is going on? Why does this happen? And so I was immediately drawn, and I looked at photo history, and photo history is a place that I love. And I thought about, well, what images of slaves do we know? And I went back to these Zealy images of Drama and Rennie. And there's certain things that this sort of presents in photographic history that I responded to. I think it's the shininess of the skin and the description of deep color. And this is because daguerreotypes and ambrotypes respond to light and describe light differently than modern technology. And so in some ways, like, I look like this because there was no other way to describe people at that time period, right? And so that's why it immediately triggered in my mind. So the project started, and this is what the images look like. They weren't full faces. This image is actually, you're like, this actually fits in the palm of your hand. It's an image that's a 3x4 image. And on this version, this does not exist on clear glass. This exists on a piece of black glass that has so there's nothing, the image comes from blackness, which for me is like a really important, it's very important about the materiality, and the surfaces of this become really important to me. To talk about process slightly, if you see this corner, I'm holding a mic, so I'll just do it with this. I'll stand in the light and do it. So when you these are clear pieces of glass that are clean, washed, cleaned, hand cut as well. And then you take a liquid that's a mixture of ether and collodion, which is how I got on the terrorist list, because post 2011, they don't really sell ether that easily. I did 3 references to buy a bottle of ether. And you take this and you pour this liquid. Collodion is also like an early plastic, and they used it in Civil War to sort of heal wounds, close wounds. So you take that and you pour it on a thin piece of glass. And so this mark here is the mark of my finger, my own hand, holding the piece of glass as I pour the chemistry on it and then slowly coat the said plate. So that's stage 1. And you can't, this is the stage, you can't do, you have to do each one. It's called wet plate collodion. So you coat said plate, not dropping said plate. Pour off the extra chemistry. I can't believe I can still do that. Pour off, it took like literally part of the 2 years process of me learning how to do this. You take that off and then you soak it in a bath of silver nitrate. That makes the plate then light sensitive. You take that plate and while it's still wet, you put it in a film holder, a 4x5 film holder, you put it in the camera and you make the exposure. At that moment, you then immediately process said plate, fix it, and then the image becomes live. So it's not like the way we think of film or digital where you just like click, it's like prep the plate, soak the plate, wait for plate, process plate, oh, plate drops. Okay. So there's a lot of things that fail. A lot of these markings are because of my hand mark, but also because of like the quality of the way things are cleaned. So like this is called oyster marking and all these other weird technical terms. So this is like a mark, even though I find this as a really interesting artistic expression, it is a sign that I did not clean the plate well initially. I give away my dirty tricks. And so after that plate is then the image arises and is fixed in water, you then take it and you basically cover that plate with a resin, which comes from tree bark, because I did it the old way. And then you take that tree bark, like silky stuff, and you heat it over a fire to make sure it seals properly. Reason number 15 of way I lose them is that you coat them over the fire, and if you don't move the glass enough, it explodes in your hand. So there are a lot of things that have happened in the failing of this project. But in the end, there are 70 amber types coated in this way. So as you can see, there's segmentation, or as the first two images suggest, there's segments of my face. And I was interested in how just sort of looking at segments or parts of the face helps to decode or tell you if something is good or bad. What was interesting, or what is interesting to me, is that the history of photography or the invention of photography aligns itself up with different types of social and visual sciences at the same time, right? Like the people were searching for ways to describe people. They were looking at physiognomy, phrenology, to figure out how to classify people, put them into groups, and then figure out what the world is, right? And so you see these drawings from the end of the 18th century into the 19th century, in which they're not poor descriptions, but it's just what people considered hard science at the time. That if your head is shaped this way, that you are an idiot or a poet. Well, that's a or both. Or both. So it's this. But like, why are people looking this way? Why are people interested in description this way? And what happens when photography now can capture this in a very different way? So I became very interested in Bertillon charts, and so and this became the model in which this project was sort of formulated on. And so this is like the first forms of mugshots, right? There's these. I was talking about this film. Everyone should watch the story of film. It's this wonderful episode things. But like how mugshots were invented. You know, the idea of a frontal and a profile was invented at some point in history, and what does the implication of that mean? And so these are charts that sort of tabulated in France all the nose shapes of the people who stole bread. And said, if you have a guy with this nose shape, well, look out. He's going to get you. I don't know. So this became really interesting because it was in some ways doing what this project ascribed to. It was trying to say character. It's not the mugshot of today, but you can see the progression, right? That like it's like trying to say this happens first, and it's like okay, today we use them. You know, this is like beginning of racial profiling, but today we use them to say, oh, this is just to prove identity. But before they're like, this identity means something, and that is a part of our human history that we have to sort of embrace and understand. So if you can see the profiles, the eyes, the nose, those became the modeling of how I sort of set forth as to how to photograph. All of these are self-portraits. All that process that I described was just me. I can't show you in these pictures, so I'll move on to the next one. And it became important to me to sort of create the variant. Could I create that entire chart with my own body? Could I use the photographic material, both its materiality and sort of exposure, to create the difference of skin tone and variation? And in doing so, sort of both ignore and embrace the beauty that is inherent in the process itself. So I just show these as triptychs because sometimes, people think of them as individuals, but then when you look at all of the profiles together or the ears together, which are absolutely fascinating. I knew what my ear looked like, and then I figured it out. And so yeah, I'm just going to stop on that side. To me, and I talk about this often, is that there's a lot going on here, because there's the ear, there's the profiling, there's understanding what it means, but there's the surface of the photograph. And the surface of the photograph becomes really important to me, and it's one of my heroes is one of my grad professors, Tom Barrow, who taught at the University of New Mexico till I was his last graduating class. And this is a project he did that's called Cancellations. And so what he would do is make these big 8x10 negative photographs, and he always wanted to remind you that you were not looking at the dome. You're looking at a photograph at the dome. So he would take an ice pick and X out his photograph for two reasons. Because it reminds you of the Xing out of printmaking, right? That this is a version of something that is over reproducible, right? And that's what photography is. But it also forces you to look through the plane of the X to see the thing behind it. And I'm always conscious of how conscious are we of the parameters of photography that we are looking through to see the things that we are looking at. And so this picture is particularly interesting to me because it's like, I don't really want to look at the dome. But I'm hyper conscious that you're forcing me to do so. And so I'm interested in that process. And you'll see it seems void in my white friends, but it's actually, to me, rather active in the photographic understanding. So I always show these because these were in the New York Times style section, and it's the same sort of surface looking through, and then I'm interested in how that description describes blackness, which I could go on and on forever about. But how do we recognize when pictures don't look like the pictures we're used to? Right, that we have an understanding of photography of the moment being very, selfie, I don't know what you want to call it, right? But it is actually a description of a time, of a materiality, and it has a timestamp. So you can see, I'm going to show you two pictures, I probably shouldn't, but these are older works before character recognitions of other things that I had made, because I was still always constantly just trying to tease at the surface, trying to force you to see through, make through what you were looking at. And so pictures of my face in a different framing method, and I don't think they're as successful, and they're obviously not as pretty. So, to me, they're obviously not as pretty. So, we're looking at the shape of the nose, we're looking at the shape of the mouth, and just a few words about the word character recognition. I was dating a guy who worked with satellites, and he was describing one day how the satellites read military tanks or planes as characters. And as the characters rotate from north, south, east, west, they would be recognized at a different percentage. And he just talked, how people just talk about their job, and you're like, I have no idea what you do. I was like, oh, that's nice, Jay, whatever. But he's sitting here describing, and he's like, isn't that interesting? As it shifts from north to west, the perception of the character is shifted, and so therefore, they're not 100%, it's still character Y. They're 80%, it's character Y. And that's what I think becomes interesting in this project. I think that as the body shifts, and as the body performs, different reads are possible, and you don't know I don't think you always read this as a slave or as a this or as a that. And so I'm hyper-conscious of the idea that the body performs. And so the two places that my face, because my ears are not so flexible, the two places that I can perform are with my mouth and with my eyes. And so I became really conscious of trying to make those performances happen with trying to think about medical pictures or toothy grins or seduction, also adding to that level of performance and trying to figure out what else or how else I could envision myself. So the last slide of this is this one, to do two things. And so one, to talk about those performances and how vision works in pictures, and if someone engages, looks at the viewer or disengages the viewer, that idea that there is something important or is seen as description I don't want to say that. It's seen as really important if someone engages the viewer in looking or not engaging the viewer in looking. And so these became really important to me. There's something about the one on the far left that I find really interesting because I was crying. To do this, the strobes the camera's 14 inches from my face, but the strobes are 9 inches away from my face to make this so bright. And you can see these are the strobe lights that are going off in my nose. And after the fourth time, I was like, but there's something about the split and the crying and the wetness that I think becomes this really powerful emotion about the idea of thinking about and being recognized and what is recognized out of my character, especially in this very racialized form. So it's with this that I end this part of the talk and move on to the other stuff. But it's with this that I had been in conversation with friends, and the work started to show, and the work is done very well. And I was just in a conversation with my friend Dan, and he's like, well, I really, they're beautiful. And I'm like, thanks. And he's like, well, you really contemplate race in really complicated ways. I was like, thanks. And I just looked at him, I go, don't you think about whiteness this way? He's like, no. I was like, well, do you think about whiteness? He's like, why? I was like, okay. And I was like, but do you think about whiteness in a picture, or how you end up being represented, or how that may be a fraction of your true self, and blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no. And and to me, it just became the Barney Stinson line of challenge accepted. Okay, how do I do this? What can this be? And how do I move this forward? This is the first project made, and this is Dan. And sort of sitting and starting to think about what whiteness can be in a photograph. And there's this part of the talk it runs chronologically to a point, and then it ends at another point. And so what happened, it starts to go into categories and things like that. So what I decided for this project is I would identify true friends. I know every single person in these pictures well. Everyone always asks me that. Do you really know? I really know them. Friends, mentors, peers who we have engaged in racial conversations or activities that have surrounded around or have been activated by race, and ask them to pose for their whiteness, right? And so in the beginning, sometimes we knew and did not know what that meant. I made this, every time it's their photographs, I made this photograph in a bikini, I didn't know what was going on. We were hanging out, and I was like, there's something about this above ground pool, there's something about this space and lights, there's something about your hair, Amy, I love it. But I didn't know really how I was beginning this construction. But I knew that I could sort of use both the people, their gestures, and the environment to sort of craft a picture and a conversation around whiteness. So I'm hyper-conscious that so some of these pictures are in the book, some of these pictures are in the show, some of the pictures are not, they're from all over. So I'm hyper-conscious as to, I don't consider them portraits, because they are, in some ways, performances of how I see them and how they may not see themselves. This is my friend Zed, who we would go to this bar and watch. He taught me hockey. I still don't like hockey. but he'd make me sit and watch hockey every Thursday night. All right.
Geography?
Rochester, New York. So the things that I'm going to cue you into to start thinking about is, I think I said them, gesture, environment, and sort of how does someone think about performing their racial identity? And what does that mean to perform their racial identity? So the second natural question that I have is, how do you have all of these white friends? Every person of color is like, oh, I totally So, I went to Convent of the Sacred Heart starting in 2nd grade because my sister was really smart. And I was like the extra kid. And my mother, I grew up in Harlem and took the bus to the Upper East Side. I can say proudly, this is also the school where Lady Gaga graduated from 20 years ago. I became instantly conscious that I racialized this community in ways I did not know. The story, this girl, you will see her picture later. There's a couple, and you'll see this picture later. And so I instantly racialized this community. I was playing, and it's an ornate mansion where the school actually takes place in. And my mother, being a savvy black woman, gave me a pin that said, "I heart being black." Sent me to school. Well, Nori's my best friend. What do? I give Nori my pin. It says, "Hey, you're my friend. I heart being black." Send Nori back home to her Upper East Side Park Avenue apartment. And what I could explain to a 7-year-old goes, "Wait, you can't take that pin off me." And their parents are like, "Okay, let's explain race. Let's explain why we don't go visit Myra at her house. Let's explain," because it's 83, right? We don't go up to Harlem to see Myra at her house. Myra's more than welcome here, but we don't go up there. So I instantly, from a very young age, racialized a community, and at the same time, forced communities to talk about race by my simple presence. And at the same time, just kept, didn't really care. So I just kept, I'm going to be here, and I'm going to do this. And so I went to this all-girl Catholic school, and then I decided to be a photographer. And so I went to a liberal arts college, and then I decided to get my master's in fine arts. Well, these are not communities, dripping with ethnicity. And so people were like, "How'd you meet all these white people?" I was like, "Well, I went to school and got a degree and then became a professor." And people had this expectation that I would isolate myself out of those communities, but in the same way, I need support and friendship as anyone else. And so from day one, I acquired a community. That acquisition, to some people, seems false and unfair, but I think any person of color would say this is a natural way of how people of color move through the world. And so some white people become offended. They're like, "Well, I can't do this backwards." I was like, "Well, have you spent yourself in marginalized communities and moved yourself through those in a systematic way since the age of 6? Well, then no, you don't have 75 friends of color. Right? It's easy to think about that inclusion and separation very easily. So, I forget where I'm at. Okay, so this is Rose in her cute little shoes. I'm not going to talk about that. So style and gesture. I think there are things that I think come up in this work that talk about or brush up against class, that brush up against gender, that brush up against just larger social ideas. And I think it's how active or inactive do you want to read this picture. This is my good friend, and to think about this picture of performance. So this is my good friend John. We have known each other since we met in summer camp, and he's my first white male friend officially. But we made this, I knew I wanted a picture. Sort of when I thought about whiteness, I knew there were categories of pictures that I wanted. And I wanted a powerful, successful man. And he does some form of trading that I don't understand. And so I went to his office to make this picture. And his office wasn't cool enough. So we waited 20 minutes till his boss left. And then so the ideas that these are truths are just foreign to me. The other part of this is this picture was in the New York Times blog Lens, and someone in his office saw it, and they were like, "Hey, John, is that a picture of you?" And he's like, "No, I don't know what you're talking about." And luckily, they had just moved offices, so no one could really confirm or deny what had happened. And so, to think about this picture, and I this is in the writing upstairs, is how do you think about portraiture or making pictures and thinking about its structure? And when I was young, when I was in that school with a cute little pinafore, I started making photographs. And I was given the book, East 100th Street, and told to go, you're a good photographer. You like people of color. You're a person of color. Make pictures like Bruce Davidson. And it was as a 12-year-old, infuriated as to the understanding how different what these pictures meant, implied, executed as. And so this is to me, and there's work by Bruce Davidson that I find stunning and beautiful, but just not this project. But to me, this was an anthropological project of a guy going to a community and saying, I'm going to tell you what they look like by the way I organize these pictures. So you will think of these girls as timid and shy, potentially because of their race, because of the way I've organized them, because of how light is structured, because of the environment around them. And then I will walk away. And I was incredible. I, for years, would rail against the system. And also rail against it because it's not Harlem. Harlem begins at 110th Street, north of Central Park. New Yorkers know that. Also infuriates me, side note number 4, is how gentrifications will then try to shift communities, right? Once communities become safe, then we can change the borders of that community. Instead of understanding its historical reasonings behind it. But anywho. So I was told, this is Harlem, make pictures like this. And I've been told in various educational institutions, your pictures need to be blacker. I've been told that a few times. And I was like, really? So then I make pictures. Then I make this picture, and I'm like, oh yeah, my pictures need to be blacker. This is my mentor, Jim Stone. If you've ever taken a photographic class, and in the last 20 years you might have used his textbook, that's the London Stone photography book. Yeah, all of a sudden you're like, oh. He's kind of he wrote the View camera book. He's a big guy. This is he's interracially married, has twin small children, and he's like, this is the only place in the house that is mine. Yes, Jim, it is. And so there's a space in which I think there is humor allowed to be played out in these pictures. This is actually Tom Barrow in his studio, the guy with the X'd out picture. These two are both in Albuquerque, New Mexico. The picture before I actually find really fascinating. And a lot of these places, I'm interested in how America can be described by its cities, but then be very uniformed in the same way. You would never think of the bowling ball pictures being Albuquerque by the stereotype of what you think of what Albuquerque is. And so there's, in many ways, the implication of the words, or I like to think about the meaning of the word stereotype. Right? So we want to stereotype the environments that these people are in. We want to stereotype who these people are described as, what they do, and how they do it. So people think, I've heard this picture described to me in so many ways, and people are concerned about her hoarding. and in truth, it is the opposite, that she is actually a huge recyclist. And all of these materials are out to be recycled. And she offered me 7 versions of. I was like, I don't want your half. No, let's go to the recycling place. This was in California, so I was like, let's just fill up the car and we'll take all this stuff away. And she's like, well, 7 locations and we have to sort them. But I was like, oh God. So this is my college roommate, or one of my college roommates. So I love these pants. That's all I'm going to say. I always don't know what to say about them because then it gets complicated. I'm going to move to this one because then there's good stories here. Okay, so there's stereotype, and so we're talking about stereotype. In my head, there's a description of stereotype, and what does it mean? And I had been running, the methodology of the project shifts as the project moves forward. And so I knew I wanted like the banker guy, and I wanted a hipster, and there were certain like things I wanted to hit on. And then I knew I wanted a photograph that was about white women's beauty. And this is a woman with the best name ever, and her name is Tatiana Zaza. And I've known her since 7th grade. And she was living in LA. And I said, Tatsi, I'm going to come out and see you. I'm going to make this photograph for you. Why? Because you're white. Okay. Cool. See you in a few weeks. This is how most of the conversations go. And I'll talk about that conversation a little bit more. And so I had this expectation because I had known Tatsi for years as this blonde, and I knew it was finger waves, and I knew what her eyes were, and I had the documentations. And when I got to LA, she was this dark-haired, sort of a different type of vixen. But it became important to me, even though I had set up this idea of gesture model environment, to sort of break that mold in at least 1 or 2 pictures, to look at something very different and distinctively. And so as much as I talk about environment, that paradigm is broken here. And I think she still is, she's beautiful. I think I wanted this beautiful woman, and I think I have one. I think I didn't even know. This is one of the moments in many of these stories where I didn't know what I was walking into. So I traveled the country, and I didn't know what would be there on the other side. The person's size, their weight, what had happened to them in the last 2, 3, 5, 6 months. The idea that I had to sort of craft a picture on its own turn. So in the flip side, I was, 2 years later, looking through the pictures, I said, Tatsi alone like this doesn't work. And so maybe I need a male counterpart. And so I made this picture of my friend John, and to me it's a story that the environment in this picture is really important, and you'll never know, and it's an internal story. And so this is actually a photograph made on the steps of the Met in New York City. And so we made all these other pictures, and I was like, no, I need this close up, and you have a big head, and so I literally said this to him. You have a big head, it'll fill the frame well. He's a photographer, so he didn't really mind it too much. But the story for me to go with this place is we often meet in New York City together. We went to graduate school together. I introduced him to his wife, who I had known since 2nd grade. There's another girl in the picture. And so we'd always meet on the steps of the Met, and he's on the cell phone. Where are you? I am the only black woman standing on the steps of the Met. Oh, there you are. Like that's like 6 or 7 times around. And so while that place is not evident in the photograph, it's evident in our history, and it's evident in the parameters in which the pictures are made. I don't think it's a water. I'm not going to say anything else. An active couple, my other college roommate, Beth Powell Whistler, and her husband, Joe. This is, in a lot of these pictures, they are pictures that have been crafted multiple times. This photograph was made 3 times. First time poorly made because she is a costume designer, and she dressed her kids up in felt, and they just awful pictures. Just felted twins in the middle. I was like, okay, let's do that again. And so the next time we took it was just horrible light. And so the 3rd time was a charm, and it took the sensitivity of sort of how the light hits this, the green plants, and sort of just how the light sort of filters through the trees, I think makes this sort of a successful picture. They were, oh my goodness, I could tell 1,000 stories. This is on the south side on 63rd Street in Chicago, and I'm driving down the street, and then this woman just yells at me, "Don't be messing with those white babies down the street." I know, lady. I'm friends with them. Whoa, you know those white people? They're the only white people for miles, because it's the South Side of Chicago. And I was like, oh, okay, it's very fun. So white spaces and places and triggers. I play a lot of sports, and I play a lot of volleyball. A lot of these people are volleyball players. And I'm interested in sort of another paradigm that I'm interested in is like the description of spaces that are particularly white opposed to particularly black. And so it's easy to describe black spaces, right? Stereotypically, like the basketball court, the club, loud movie theaters, right? And so I'm interested in sort of what is that reverse description. And so it is always interesting. We'll come up to another picture. People will turn to a friend of mine, and she's a little bit taller than me, and they turn to me and say, "You play basketball, right?" And they turn to her and they go, "You play volleyball, right?" What is that assumptive space about? Like, when am I not included into people and places? My brother-in-law. This is my hipster male. Maybe I don't need to say anything else. Okay. With hipster male dog. I mean, so a lot of people comment about the gestures in these pictures, and this is another picture that actually this took 5 shoots, shockingly, 3 trips, 5 shoots to make, and so for many of these people, it's the first time that they've performed or been asked to do something for their whiteness. Right? So I've been asked numerous times to be in all the diversity population programming for every piece of racial and I swear to you, I get like 1984, 1999. Like, and so asking someone to say, oh, I just need, people pretend that that's not what happens to people of color, but to say that very articulately, what I'm going to photograph you because you are white and because you're my friend. Well, what do I wear? What do I wear that is white? Well, I can't tell you that. I personally cannot answer that question. Okay, so I'll just show up and we'll get there. And so we, with Tate, and he goes, well, how do I stand? And this idea that standing or sitting or like, how do I physically embody that whiteness becomes a really engaging question to me. A lot of people say, oh, they look so awkward. And I think it's because there's the conversation going on in the back of their mind that this is perhaps a performance. I don't know. I can only ask some of you in the room to go, okay, go home. Here's your exercise. Go home and make a picture of your whiteness. And do you look different than if you're making a picture as you think about another area or activity of your mind? Small things stand into symbols about classism. While this woman is a social worker, and you would never know that, and there's in the basement this is the basement apartment of her husband. You can thwart what people are by the signs of the things that are in here. So like somehow those statues and the snow sort of like there's weird signs. Things are in conflict, and you somehow have to choose the priority as to what means the most. And most people choose those stone vitrines as being the information of the picture. I love this photograph. More because maybe it's how I know him, and he considers himself this very grand person, and I wanted this tree to sort of activate the bigness that he is, but he's just sort of this little guy in sambas. There are types that I think I see in the world, and I feel like he's the articulation of a type. And I think this is a photograph in which the environment supersedes the idea of the body. I screwed up, but we'll get back there. This is another one where I feel like the architecture of the lamp is sort of the same thing. I've been obsessed with this lamp for years. Tried to take it off of them. You'll meet the partner in a moment. But yeah. So places of work, homes, activities, free time, anywhere we can sort of shove in a picture. She's there are a couple of people I'm also interested in who are first generation Americans or first generation white. or first generation, I'll just say first generation Americans. She's Greek, first generation American, speaks 4 languages. This is her in her French classroom. The guy with his feet up on the table is actually first generation Irish. The volleyball player is first generation Irish. But like some of that immigration story is immediately dissolved, right? And whiteness becomes prioritized. And so with these people, I have these conversations with them, and a lot of them circulate in these things. They're like, I'm not white. She's like, I'm not white, I'm Greek. I'm like, no one sees that. Until she starts yelling Greek at you with her mother in the room. Oops, sorry. Mic caught on thing. I became mildly interested, or not mildly, greatly interested in the idea of the anonymous white guy. Something that I see and can find very intimidating. This is my friend Nathaniel, and he has the like edge of hip hop culture around him, right? The hoodie, the music, and I'm always fascinated that when that is described with whiteness, it's okay. But if this is placed on a black body, it is seen as scary, intimidating, and overwhelming. But I can actually say reversely that it's not, for me, it's not racialized, that activity, like the hoodie and the no eyes. But I'm always fascinated that he gets passed, but others of my black friends who would dress the same way would not. He hates this picture because he's like, nobody knows who I am. It's all about you, Nathaniel. So I started like interested in like, well, what are these other anonymous types that exist, and like the spaces that they exist in. And so, there's certain things that black people don't do. We don't ski or hike or snow or so. I'm just enjoying this way too much. And so it became important to make those pictures in places and spaces that look like places that black people would not be. And in some ways, I enjoy having people imagine what I look like in this space, photographing them. So this is another anonymous guy. It's like this was like the beginning of the beards, like in cultural history in 2008. Like the bearded guy with, I was like, you guys all look the same, but. Sorry. So then I thought about like, how does that work on a woman? How does that, and for me, there's a New York woman that has the big glasses, that is over-articulated, that is over-stylized, that wants to be seen but not known. And so this woman, Michelle, we were interns together at the Museum of Modern Art years ago. I think she really takes that on very well. In which you know her type. It is not a description of Michelle, it's a description of that type. Last one, and it sort of fades into another category, which is a category of maybe 2. But I've just sort of how we see and not see. People are interested in this picture. They don't. For some people, there was just time when someone said, well, he's not white, he's European. And I was like, well, no. There was something about his face that felt ethnic. And then I became interested in that idea as well, that the description of ethnic is not a part of the description of whiteness. And so people want to push that ethnicity, or that viewing of ethnicity, out of this realm of whiteness. And so the implication of that is the idea that there's something pure. Right? But I don't know if that's true or not. He's still white, he grew up in Batavia, New York. I mean, but then we have this guy, right? Who is like the furthest along that spectrum, and everyone's like, no, he's Puerto Rican, he's Dominican, he's anything but. And I enjoy that conversation because I think that blackness, or black folk, have a way of having that conversation differently, right? About dialect, about style, about class, and have the ability, and all of these groups have the ability to include or exclude people based on any terms that they wish. But why do you want to do that? I'm not 100% sure. We're going to have a palette cleanser of a totally different type of picture. The idea of taking on the description of whiteness is not to, I think the implied idea for many is that there's the idea that by saying whiteness is good or bad, And that's not what this project tries to assert in any form. It is merely to offer the idea of a description, to say that if we are going to describe other communities with ethnic terms, then we have to describe all communities with ethnic terms, right? To put everyone on the spot for that. I've taught photography for the last 12 years, and one of the most frustrating terms and things that happens is that when people say, put a photograph up on the wall, and they say, describe this picture, because that's the act of looking, is sort of taking visual information and just putting it into words. So they'll say, oh, it's a girl walking across the street eating a lollipop. Okay, describe this picture. Oh, it's a black girl sitting on a bicycle. Wait a second. Why do we use race here as a part of a description process, right? There's an implication when you use race here than when you don't use race here. So the easier way is to use race everywhere. That's my answer. It seems like an easier answer. It doesn't feel like a comfortable answer. It doesn't feel, it's funny because my mother and my grandmother use race all the time. They're New Yorkers. They're like, oh, this Chinese woman and I were talking down the street, and then the Jew said everything. And I was like, especially my grandmother. She has no problem. But she comes from this active place of saying, if you're going to describe me, then I'm going to describe everybody. And it changes the implication. It changes how you have racial conversation, and it changes the way you would expect and think about those things. And as I predicted, I'm going to have 7 slides left, and I think I've said almost everything. But there was one thing else I was going to say. I don't know what it is. I can just tell stories about people from now on. Everybody loves this picture. She's the girl who everybody thinks we play volleyball together, and they say, you play volleyball, and Myra, you play basketball, and I just roll my eyes in discontent. Another very active, there's so much going on around us, and to me, this picture feels really quiet. And to say there are 3 guys hitting on her, and a ball guy, someone poking my equipment out of the way, it was complete madness. But it feels like sort of a really contained and constructed thing. Oh, that's what I can talk about that. The idea of construction and performance. And so Courtney and I were talking about this picture earlier. I didn't mention this part, but I can mention 2 parts about this picture. She's married. This photograph is made in the same room, but not at the same time as the big art photograph. Those 2 people are married. And Eric and Jason, we had a long conversation about how they see themselves as others because they are Jewish. And the story of the Jewish land is a place of otherness. And so they really have a hard time as identifying as white. And the continued conversation saying, you live in Park Slope, Brooklyn, and one of the most expensive blocks in the land. You are white to many. And they're we are white to many, we are not white to each other, we are Jewish. And how interesting, and how self-perception in race is very interesting to me. The other part of this is she's an architect, and I've been trying to make pictures in her firm, this really beautiful glass building, for months. Just couldn't do it. So we finally made this picture, and she had just, and you would never know this, but she had a baby a month before this picture. Yeah, it's annoying. And we had this other conversation later about, she's like, it's so interesting how I wanted to be this thing. I wanted to be the strong architect, hard lady. You describe me as a mother. I'm performing. She doesn't smile. She didn't smile at her own wedding. It's really funny in her wedding pictures. She looks exactly the same in her wedding pictures. But, and so she's like, I've performed this role of motherhood. I was like, perform? You don't smile. But the idea that people understood what and how they exist in this project, and it was a smaller, not a description of them as a whole, but a slice. They could present themselves as a slice of reality to a larger picture. This is Courtney's favorite picture. He's going to be here Saturday, so you should all just come Saturday. He's driving down from Chicago. I'm not joking you. Be here Saturday. I'm not going to talk about it. You can ask me questions. And this is my lady hipster. In response to male hipster, I felt like I needed one to balance it out. She's the other girl sitting. She's the smaller one sitting in that second grade picture. Oh, you know. Oh yeah, and the girl with the stone stuff in the back was the other girl in the picture from high school. So I have 4 pictures left, but I can't think of anything else to say. I feel like I have talked for 54 minutes, and so I'm more than welcome to answer questions, engage in conversation. Tell me what you think. Oh, faster! Isn't he handsome? Whole life. He's a beautiful man. He plays water polo still in his 40s. It's pretty impressive. I love this photograph, and it's funnier to me that there's like this to me is also about that space, just like the tree. This is at our mutual friend's home, so it's not even the house that either, like, we both have been there twice. I was like, let's make a picture here. And he's like, okay. So that's the last picture. So with that, thank you.